An ordinary grocery trip turns into an unforgettable showdown when an elderly woman tells a young black man to go back to Africa. What he says next doesn't just silence the room, it changes everything. Among the rows of fresh produce, an older woman, probably in her early 80s, stood adjusting her pearl-framed glasses. With her white curls pinned neatly and a floral sweater wrapped tight, she looked like someone's sweet grandmother, but what came out of her mouth was anything but gentle. At the citrus display nearby, a tall young black man named Malik, dressed in a charcoal hoodie and denim joggers, reached out for a mesh bag of tangerines while scrolling through something on his phone. He had a relaxed demeanor, the kind of guy who didn't stand out much, until she made sure he did. Her voice, suddenly sharp and laced with disdain, cut through the store like a knife. "People like you don't belong in places like this," she spat, loud enough for at least half a dozen people to hear. Malik blinked, slowly lifting his head as he lowered the phone. His expression was unreadable at first, like someone caught between disbelief and restraint. But the woman wasn't finished. Her next words landed with cruel precision. "Why don't you return to Africa, or wherever you came from?" The store's hum came to a halt. Conversations died, footsteps paused, and several eyes darted in their direction. A teenager near the frozen section pulled out an earbud. A young dad holding a toddler hesitated before turning away. For a few unbearable seconds, no one moved, no one breathed. Malik stood frozen, his grip tightening around the handle of his shopping basket. He could have snapped, he could have shouted, walked away, made a scene. 1,000 possible replies burned behind his eyes. But instead, he paused. He breathed, slowly, purposefully. He shifted his basket into his other hand and straightened up. He didn't speak immediately. He stood there, radiating quiet strength, while the weight of her words lingered in the stale air. The woman held her apples defiantly, as though waiting to be challenged. Her gaze was fixed, her chin raised in contempt. A teenage clerk organizing pineapples nearby stopped stacking and watched, unsure if he should intervene. A cashier several lanes down leaned sideways to catch a glimpse. The moment had become something larger than just a rude comment. It had become a test of character, and everyone knew it. Malik finally looked the woman in the eyes, calm but firm, his silence more commanding than any outburst could have been. The entire store seemed to lean in, waiting for the response that would shift everything. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and composed, slicing clean through the tension like a blade. "Ma'am," he began, not with accusation, but with a patient clarity that commanded attention. "Do you even hear what you just said?" It wasn't a challenge. It was a mirror held up in front of her, inviting reflection. But she wasn't having it. "I meant it," she snapped without hesitation, her voice loud and brittle. "This is my land. People like you never belonged here." That was the spark. A young man near the cereal shelves gasped, and a ripple of murmurs stirred through the growing crowd. Still, Malik didn't flinch. He didn't yell or step forward. Instead, he stood firm and still, letting the silence bloom around her statement, allowing it to sit heavily in the ears and hearts of everyone nearby. "Okay," he said after a pause, nodding slowly, his tone steady and impossible to ignore. "Let's go there, since you insisted." It wasn't anger in his eyes, it was something more powerful. Resolve. He gently lowered his basket to the floor, a simple motion that somehow made the room feel smaller, tighter. His stillness drew people in like gravity, including those who had been pretending not to notice. Fixing his gaze on her, not with hatred but with a quiet intensity, he began. "You say I don't belong here," he said evenly. "But let me tell you where I come from." Each word was weighted, deliberate. "My great-great-grandfather was born in Louisiana. He tilled soil he could never own, worked sunup to sundown just to give his children the slightest edge in life. Before him, his father was chained and dragged from the shores of West Africa, forced into labor to help build this nation. Your roads, your farms, your economy." She said nothing now, her lips pressed tight. Around them, not a single cart moved. A woman with a toddler stopped mid-step. A man near the dairy section lowered his coffee to listen. "My grandfather," Malik went on, his voice gaining quiet force, "served in the Korean War. He wore the uniform, risked everything for the stars and stripes, only to come back and be told he couldn't eat in the same restaurants or sleep in the same hotels. And still, he stayed. Because he believed in what this country could be." The store felt suspended in time, the usual drone of refrigerators now eerily hushed. "My mother is a librarian. She's spent 30 years making sure kids, no matter where they're from, have a chance to learn. My father's a bus driver. The kind of man who would pull over without a second thought to help someone. Yes, even you, if your tire blew out on a cold night. He paused, letting that image land. So, when you tell me I don't belong, he continued, his voice thick with something deeper now, something unshakable. When you suggest I should go back to somewhere I've never been, you're not just wrong, you're ignoring the truth. My family has earned every piece of ground we stand on. In labor, in service, in sacrifice. Her face flushed, hands trembling as she clutched the apples like lifelines. Her mouth opened slightly, but the words never came. Malik stepped back, never losing his composure. I could have just walked away, he said, turning to address the quiet crowd now watching him in stunned silence. But that solves nothing. Silence doesn't cure ignorance. We're all responsible for making this better, for stopping things like this before they start. The silence that followed was profound. No one moved. Her face was a storm of confusion, embarrassment, and something else, something like regret. Anger, discomfort, and something more complex, perhaps regret, washed across her face, her eyes darting from one face in the crowd to another, searching desperately for agreement, for support, but none arrived. It was a man in his late 40s, wearing a faded Yankees cap, who finally stepped forward. "He's right," he said, his voice calm but firm, slicing through the silence. "We're better than this." His words seemed to unlock something. A woman by the freezer aisle, silver-haired and trembling slightly, nodded as she spoke. "My brother fought in Korea," she said softly. "He always told me that the only color that matters is the one we all bleed." The energy shifted. A young employee behind a checkout lane, couldn't have been older than 21, raised her voice from across the store. "That was powerful," she said, blinking back emotion. "Thank you for standing up like that." The older woman, once defiant, now looked shaken. Her hands gripped her cart like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. She didn't apologize, not directly, but the fire in her eyes had dulled to embers. When she did try to speak, her voice was barely a whisper. "I didn't mean," she began, faltered, and let the rest dissolve. Malik turned to her once more, his expression now softened but unwavering. "It's not just about what you meant," he said gently. "It's about what people hear and how it lands. Words matter. What we do with them matters even more." From the deli counter, someone began clapping, just once, then again, hesitant at first, but it spread. The sound grew, not raucous, but sincere. Applause rippled through the store, not just for the eloquence Malik had shown, but for the strength it took to answer cruelty with grace. The woman looked around once more, her face pale and uncertain, then slowly pushed her cart toward the automatic doors without saying another word. A few people came over, placing hands on Malik's shoulder or offering brief, heartfelt nods. "Thank you for saying what most of us couldn't," a woman whispered as she passed. Malik gave a small smile, lifting his basket again as if closing the chapter. "Sometimes it's not about arguing," he said quietly, almost to himself. "It's about making sure the truth has a voice." Gradually the crowd dispersed, but something had shifted. The usual rhythm of the store returned, but with a new tone, subtler, more introspective. Some shoppers looked contemplative, others moved with quiet reverence, and it was clear the moment had left a mark. Malik continued his shopping, unhurried, like someone carrying not just groceries, but the weight of what had just transpired. At checkout, the same young cashier scanned his items and looked up with a timid smile. "What you said earlier, it meant a lot," she said. "Not many people could have handled that the way you did." Malik smiled in return, voice warm but calm. "Sometimes grace is the only way to be heard. Anger just builds more walls." As he stepped outside, the evening sun painted golden streaks across the asphalt, casting long shadows between the cars. Walking to his vehicle, Malik noticed the same elderly woman seated inside hers, hands clenched on the steering wheel, staring out into the distance. For a second, he considered approaching her, but something in her expression told him the words had already reached her, and some truths needed time to settle. That night, as Malik sat across from his father at their kitchen table, recounting the day's events, his father listened quietly, nodding slowly, his weathered hands folded on the wood, his silence deeper than words. "You handled it the right way, son," his father said at last, his voice low but full of pride. "Not just for yourself, for everyone who stood there and saw what you did. Folks like that woman might not change overnight, but you gave her something to think about. That's where it starts. You plant a seed, and you let time and truth do the rest." Malik nodded slowly, the words settling deep. The encounter at the store had been jarring, but he understood now that it served a greater purpose. Prejudice doesn't dissolve unless it's challenged, and silence only lets it grow stronger. Meanwhile, in a quiet house across town, the older woman sat alone at her dinner table, staring at a full plate that remained untouched. Malik's voice echoed in her mind, not the tone, but the weight behind his words. They sliced through years of assumptions she had never thought to question. She thought about her grandkids, about the world they were inheriting, and something stirred inside her, not rage, not pride, but uncertainty, maybe even remorse. Over the following days, news of what happened in that grocery aisle began to spread, weaving its way through neighbors, church groups, and coffee shops. People weren't just talking about the confrontation, they were talking about Malik's grace, his strength, and the way he held his ground without raising his voice. What had begun as an isolated incident turned into something larger, a story about the impact of calm courage and the undeniable weight of truth when spoken with dignity. Malik never sought recognition, but wherever he went, people approached him, thanking him, sharing their own painful histories, feeling inspired to speak where once they had remained quiet. His moment of resolve became a spark for conversations that had long been buried. Even the woman from the store began to shift. Not all at once, but gradually, she started to examine the beliefs she had once clung to without question. She didn't know if she'd ever see Malik again, but if she did, she hoped her heart would be brave enough to say the words she couldn't that day. Stories like this remind us of something powerful, that decency doesn't always come with raised voices or grand gestures. Sometimes it's the quiet, steady stand that leaves the deepest mark. It shows us that truth, when delivered with sincerity, can soften the hardest edges. Let this moment be a reminder, for all who witnessed it and all who hear it now, that your voice matters. Your choices carry weight. They can build bridges or burn them. They can cause pain or begin healing. And if this story touched you, consider passing it on. Like, subscribe, and share, because spreading messages of empathy, strength, and unity is how we shape a better world, one moment at a time.